Hi, good afternoon everybody. Thank you for coming in. You're welcome to my office. We're going to have this first introduction class to Biol 101 in my office because you're going to visit this often. And I needed to let you know where my office is so that you can spend time here after the class to know about questions and queries. The room is not available today, so we're sitting here. As you can see, there are two pictures of birds in the back. The reason is Biol 101 course, and we're talking about living organisms. Biol stands for biology, and 101 is a small number. It's not 107 or 110. The reason is 101 means it's an introduction course to biology. Biology is the study of living organisms. The difference between a living organism is one which can have a component that is made of what's called a cell that has a nucleus and a cytoplasm, and there are different kinds of cells. Like we are 40 trillion cells. We are a complex multicellular organism, a human being. So we can sense the environment, differences in the environment by different senses like eyes for sight, hearing from ears, smell from nose, and taste from mouth, and touch. So those are the five senses. So we are able to respond to the environment by looking at the heat or the amount of light. If it's too light, we'll move to a dark area. If it's too hot and our skin senses that, we're going to move to a colder area. I have an air conditioner blowing in my office because it's really hot outside. Okay. On the other hand, a non-living object is going to be also very complex, and air conditioning is a complex piece of machinery. It has many components, but unlike a living organism, it cannot reproduce. It cannot respond to the environment. It is programmed by us to do what we want it to do. Right? On the other hand, there are some living organisms that act like non-living. Can anybody tell me one of them? Yes, I'll have to say. For instance, prion proteins, viruses. Many people still argue that they're non-living, or they're borderline living and non-living. And towards the end of this course, when we'll have gone through this course, we are going to discuss that. Okay? Now, why take this course? What's the advantage for a pre-med student to take this course? As I said, this is Biol or Biology 101. Means it's an introduction course, and if you look at the lecture plan, you're going to see topics such as the digestive system, respiratory system, anatomy, physiology, histology, embryology, ecology, evolution, such topics, photosynthesis covered in this course. That's a diverse range of topics. We are going to just be introduced to those topics in this course. Okay? We're not going to go in detail. You're going to touch some of these in your pre-med courses, like maybe talk about anatomy, physiology, and other things. I'll teach you cell biology in a later course, maybe in your second year. So, you're going to see all these courses, all these topics covered in this course. And that's important because you're going to be studying as a pre-med or a medical student after completing this. You're going to be studying the most complex body. So you need to have a very strong foundation, and this course is going to offer you that. Okay, you're going to study human biology, you're going to be introduced to all the concepts of the living system within us, the digestive system, the respiratory system, and the nervous system, the ecology, and how we respond to the environment. So what are the unifying themes for a living system? A living system such as us does not live by itself, it lives in an environment. And that study is called ecology. We respond to something that is called abiotic factors. Abiotic factors are things like temperature, light, humidity. Okay? Those are environmental factors that influence how we react to it. If it is too hot, I'm going to sweat. If it is too cold, I'm going to wear a jacket and sit like this. Right? So, our body responds to those abiotic or non-living factors in a manner because we have 5 senses and we have a nervous system. So, it responds to protect us from those elements if they are deleterious. If it is raining, I'm going to find shelter. I'm going to come into my office. and switch on the air conditioner. Or if it is too hot, I'm going to switch on my heater sitting there. So, this is how we would react to an environment. Therefore, a living system can be composed of single cells, such as prokaryotes, which are organisms such as bacteria. I'm going to show you a figure in a little bit of a bacterial species. Or it could be a eukaryotic species like us. We are a multi-species or a multi-cellular organism. We can have eukaryotic species that are single celled, like yeast that you use to make bread or beer. So now let's look at some cellular components. This image is a little, I'm just going to use my computer in a minute. So today we're going to briefly talk of something called a plasma membrane. So here, I hope it is visible to you all. I know we're using my office today, so it's a little difficult. This is what's a lipid bilayer. This is the component that surrounds an animal cell. We are an animal, so this is the lipid bilayer that is going to be surrounding each one of our multicellular cells, which are about 40 trillion in our body. The basic structure is identical. It's got an amphipathic molecule, a charged molecule with a lipid tail, and two sets of those form a lipid bilayer. And this is what's called the fluid mosaic model. You have these protein molecules that are floating around. They can be all external, transmembrane, such as like that. These molecules are involved in sensing the environment outside of a cell. So you heard of the molecule, the hormone insulin. It has an insulin receptor that it attaches to on the outside of the cell. That then causes a chemical change within the cell, allowing glucose to go inside the cell. Now we are going to talk of something else. So you saw a lipid cell. Here is a sample or schematic of a cell wall. Now the difference between plants and animals is that plant cells have a cell wall. So here is a cell wall, which is basically has this component of complex carbohydrates like lignin, cellulose, suberin. These kind of complex cellulose molecules or complex carbohydrates form a very hard shell around the plant cell. The plant cells tend to be much more robust than animal cells. Animal cells tend to be flexible because we move around a lot. At the difference between an animal cell and a plant cell. So here I have a little image of an animal cell and a plant cell. Okay, so an animal cell is bound by a plasma membrane layer. It has a nucleus which contains the genetic component of a cell. Okay, here's a nucleus from a plant cell, which is almost identical. They have chromosomes too, just like us. Chromosomes are the DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. You want to learn more of that in genetics later down the road in this course. It's the one that binds to histone proteins, which are proteins that when they're complex with the DNA form a structure called chromosome. You might have heard of 23 pairs of chromosomes within humans. Well, those chromosomes are made of a complex of proteins called histones and the DNA. That allows that DNA to be packaged more compactly and fit within a cell. Here we have a schematic of different molecules. This may not be very visible to you, but I'm going to try and talk you through it. So from left to right, we're going in increasing size, starting from 0.1 nanometers for an atom, then a fullerene molecule, then the lipid bilayer, then a protein molecule, then poliovirus, flu virus, smallpox, bacteria, mitochondrion, red blood cell, animal plant cell, pollen, human egg and frog egg. So you can see These are different components that's out there in the handout, so I'm going to quickly run through it to just show you that. Okay. Now that you have an idea for this, a living organism then could be unicellular, it could be multicellular such as us, or a plant for that matter. And it has the ability to sense and respond to the environment at multiple levels. Could be very transient, meaning very short, for a few minutes, for a few seconds, for a few milliseconds, or it could be a process that begins and the change is visible after a really long time, and that is called evolution, which we are going to address towards the end of this class. Okay. We also of course have a chapter where we will talk about it in more detail, but today is just an introduction. So a living system then has the ability to interact among itself. You can have complex relationships. For instance, you can have an infection event where a prokaryote such as a bacteria can invade the body, human body, and cause a disease. You can get different diseases such as cholera or from a bacteria, or an infection, a lung infection, pneumonia for instance, or you can get an infection from a virus. These are complex. On the other hand, in your gut, that is in our intestines, we have about 5 to 7 pounds of bacteria that are working with us to help digest our food. Okay? So that is how complex that relationship is. Alright. So now let's briefly talk about evolution. You've seen some unifying themes. Living components, living organisms can be unicellular, they can be multicellular, they should have the ability to interact with each other in complex relationships. Those could be infections, those could be symbiotic, those could be commensalism. Okay, these are different forms of interaction. An infection is one that is deleterious to one organism and not the other. An infection could invade a human body and cause disease. A commensal could be bacteria that are living happily within your gut, causing you no problems. Symbiotic is, for example, nitrogen fixing bacteria in plant legumes, where bacteria live within root nodules in a plant and they get an environment to happily live while they fix atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates or nitrites, so that the plant can assimilate that and use that nitrogen source. So that is a win-win situation for both the bacteria and the plant. Okay, these are some examples of relationships between different organisms. You can also have food chains and food webs, where an animal is being predatory on another animal, which is called the prey, as a food source. An animal could use a vegetation as a food source, like a herbivore. We're going to talk about that in ecology towards the end of the course again. Alright? So now we will finally touch on what we call evolution. Evolution is a process in which a biological entity such as us can respond to an environmental stress signal, okay, and undergo a change that could be temporary or permanent, and then it would end up in a species specific change that would be permanent, because it would be incorporated within our DNA. I will give you an analogy. An analogy is an example where we can see an example and then kind of understand the concept of evolution. So for instance, this door that you see on my left is a door that's about 7 feet high, but if you imagine that it was only 3.5 feet, then when you open that door, people who are really short would have a competitive advantage to get in through that door and go out. So there would be a selective pressure on the height. If a person was a gnome or a small guy, he could easily enter through that door and go out. A person who was really tall, let's say 6'5", he would find it very difficult to go through that door. And if we just imagine for a moment that only if people who are under 3 feet 5 inches could go through that door, then most of this class would be selected against and they would end up being in this room. And if you were to ask to leave this room, only people under that height were allowed then those would be able to go out. The door would then act as a selective pressure, and people would be forced to go out. Those guys would be selected for and would end up out. The rest of the population would end up getting segregated or left behind. So what would you need in this case? You would need a large population within this room with variability in height, okay, and a selective pressure, which is the door. And then finally the selective pressure would allow only people under the height of 3 foot 5 inches to go out of this room and end up outside in the hallway. Okay, so that would be the selective pressure. People could then travel outside and go. The rest of the people would be selected against and they would end up inside. So natural selection or evolution in this context is the process where selective pressure, constant selective pressure because of ecological or environmental changes would force the variant population and select for some variant groups within a population and offer them a competitive advantage to be more prolific and divide and prosper over the rest of the population. And those guys would end up having a competitive advantage and grow. So over a course of time, you would find some members of that population disappear or become much reduced in number as versus others who would have the competitive advantage. Okay. So this is evolution, which is sort of the unifying theme where you talk of how a multicellular organism responds to an environment. I'm going to stop here now and ask you to ask me questions, and I will respond to those questions and try to answer them the best possible way I can, and we will start in earnest with our next class. So anyone who has a question, please raise your hand. Okay, thanks. So this gentleman's question is, what is a prokaryote? Can you kindly explain what a prokaryote is again? A prokaryote versus a eukaryote. A prokaryote is a simpler cell. A eukaryote is a more complex cell. Okay. Prokaryote has an ill-defined nucleus bound by a very poor plasma membrane, while a eukaryote has a more complex plasma membrane. The nuclear material in that is not very nicely segregated into chromosomes. It's loosely bound by non-histone proteins. In case of a eukaryote, it's bound by histone proteins. The ribosome has a different sedimentation rate, it's smaller in size. The endoplasmic reticulum is lacking in the prokaryotes. It has sac-like structures called microsomes, while in case of the eukaryote, it has an endoplasmic reticulum. So these are some of the differences between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. With that, I end this class, and I ask you to pick up the lecture plan and the handouts for today's class, and we will meet again in the next class on Wednesday. Thank you very much.